Our country was founded on the principle of freedom. But what does freedom really mean? Does it mean not being told what to do? Or is it the power to make your own choices? In his new book, my guest today argues that freedom for all is a unifying idea and the path forward. Hello, Vermont. Popular wisdom holds that it isn't polite to talk about politics. It's too polarizing, makes us angry at each other. But there's politics, and then there are the ideas that animate civic societies. And maybe we don't talk enough about those, like liberalism, a very old and potentially misunderstood set of ideas and political strategies that protect the goal of personal freedom. My guest today defines liberalism as a fairly big tent that has had space for everyone from Ronald Reagan and Milton Friedman to Franklin Roosevelt and Bernie Sanders. Alex Zakaras is a professor of political science at UVM and the author of the new book, Freedom for All: What a Liberal Society Could Be. Dr. Zakaras, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
I'm absolutely excited to have this conversation with you. So I am going to confess, I was a political science major at UCLA, and
Excellent.
Nonetheless, I have looked up the definition of liberalism multiple times, partly because liberal is a political term, it's a politicized term, and liberalism means something very different. So since that's a big, important premise in your book, help us understand, what is liberalism?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it is, you're right, confusing because the term is used in different ways. I mean, when we're talking about politics in ordinary conversation, we use the term liberalism to describe people who are politically left, right? So the more liberal you are, the more you fall on the left.
Correct.
That is not the sense of the term that I'm going to be using today, and so when political scientists and historians use the term liberalism, they're generally talking about a political outlook that's defined, I would say, on the one hand by a shared goal, and on the other hand by a shared set of strategies. So the shared goal is simply freedom. Liberals aspire to create a society in which people can live freely. And they've generally emphasized personal freedoms, the importance of freedoms like freedom of speech, freedom of association and religion, the freedom to love who you want to love, the freedom to work and own property. Right?
These are the ideas that animated the Founding Fathers.
Absolutely. The Founding Fathers were influenced by a number of different streams of ideas, but liberal ideas were certainly right up there in shaping the Declaration of Independence, in shaping the US Constitution. The other thing that liberals have generally agreed on is a whole raft of strategies designed to try to create free societies. And these will be familiar to your listeners. So constitutions, individual rights protected by independent judiciaries, the rule of law, democratic accountability, checks and balances, a free press, open civil society, and economic markets. These are the strategies that liberals, whether they incline to the right or left, have generally agreed on. And as you said, one of the things to notice about this definition of liberalism is that it's a fairly big tent. It includes people like Reagan and Milton Friedman on the right. It includes people like Franklin Roosevelt. And I'd say Bernie Sanders for sure on the left. The version of liberalism that I defend in the book is very much a liberalism in the style of Franklin Roosevelt. But it's important to see that it's been a big tradition.
Yeah, and in fact, actually, the style of liberalism that you talk about in the book, you define it as radical liberalism. And that word radical sometimes can make people feel a little, on edge. What does it mean? So what does radical liberalism mean to you?
Great. And I do think, in this political climate, it's quite important to explain what I mean by this and what I don't. Right? So,
well, terms. I mean, it's like, this is an interesting thing. When we're talking about politics, when we're talking about, maybe we should say when we're talking about civics or civic society, words can sometimes become so loaded that we stop listening and we stop hearing.
You're right.
So so radical liberalism, tell us.
Yeah, so first I would say this is not something I've invented. Since the very beginning of this republic, there have been people who use liberal principles, the idea of equal freedom and equal rights, to fight mainly for working people and disadvantaged minorities in our society. So I'm thinking about the abolitionists and early feminists who agitated for equal rights for women. I'm thinking of the early labor organizers who formed the first unions in this country. I'm thinking of Tom Paine going all the way back to the American founding and his idea of the rights of man. And that tradition extends all the way through the civil rights movement, the FDR era, right? So when I think about radical liberalism, I think about three things. First, a version of liberalism that takes human equality seriously. And so it's serious about realizing a society in which everybody has an equal claim to freedom and focuses really on expanding the range of options for people who have the least of it. Second, I think about embracing what I call a robust idea of freedom. It's something I can talk more about if you'd like, but the idea of freedom that I defend in the book is really the sort of the power to make choices.
We mentioned that a little bit at the beginning, the idea of like, what does freedom really mean?
Right.
Does it mean not being told what to do,
Yep.
or does it mean having the power to make choices?
Right.
It's a subtle difference, but it's an important difference.
It's a really important difference. And this idea of freedom as the power to make choices actually has a long history in this country. I mean, if you go back to Franklin Roosevelt, in 1944, he delivers a State of the Union address in which he famously says, individual liberty is impossible without economic security and independence, right? And this is the speech in which he also says, necessitous men are not free men, right? And what he's doing there is giving voice, I think, to a little bit of common sense, which says that if you're struggling to make ends meet, if you're struggling to make rent, if you're working 2 or 3 jobs, and extremely long hours just to meet your basic needs, I mean, your range of options has really shrunk, right? There's so much that you can't do in life. On the other hand, if you're earning a livable wage, you've got health care, you've got a secure job, the world opens up, right? And so
you have more self-determination.
Absolutely, and that's what, and so.
Which is more personal freedom.
Absolutely, so the title of the book is Freedom for All. In the book, I defend a version of freedom that's very much in line with sort of this FDR version. And as you point out, there is another idea of freedom, a competing idea of freedom. Let's call it the Elon Musk idea of freedom that's circulated in this society for a very long time, which basically says, look, freedom means not being told what to do. And if you think about the political implications of that alternative idea of freedom, it points in a really different direction, right? Towards getting government off your back and allowing people to sink or swim on their own, right? Slashing taxes and regulations, lower investments in childcare and healthcare and schooling, right? Letting people go it alone, essentially.
Less of a safety net.
Getting government off people's backs. This, I mean, when you look at throughout American history, the wealthiest Americans, when they sing the song of freedom, it's almost always this version of freedom, which serves their interest quite well.
Yeah, well, and so you do say in the book that liberalism is in crisis today, and in part that's because of a breakdown in our social contract.
Yes.
That's kind of what you're referring to right now when you're talking about the differences in perception of what freedom means, a bit.
For sure.
Yeah.
For sure.
And
so,
do
ahead.
You want to go ahead? No, I was going to say.
Sure. Well, I can talk about the breakdown of social contract if you'd like.
Yes, exactly. Well, because partly we're talking about widening inequality.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this country's economy has changed a lot in the last 4.5 decades since Ronald Reagan came to power. Right. We've seen skyrocketing inequality. We now, I mean, historians now describe this as a second Gilded Age. Right. We're seeing levels of inequality we haven't seen since the age of the robber barons, which nobody remembers as a good time in this country's history.
Right.
Right. And you know, I could run through the numbers about unequal wealth and income, and they're pretty stark. Right. We just learned recently.
It's a wedge in society.
It's a wedge in society.
It's dividing us away from each other.
Yeah.
We're feeling like we're going into very different directions.
Absolutely. And it's not just inequality. Right. There's a lot of studies now that show that economic mobility has really eroded in this country. Right, so Americans have always prided themselves, despite the inequalities that have existed in the society, on widespread opportunity. You work hard, you can get ahead, you can move up. It turns out now, if you're born poor in Denmark, you're much more likely to reach the top quintile of earners than if you're born poor in the United States.
Right, right.
And then, in some ways, the most telling stuff to me is about economic insecurity. So people's wages, if you look at them over time, are much more volatile from year to year. Their jobs are less secure. Scholars who study economic insecurity look at things like mortgage foreclosure rates, look at eviction rates, look at personal bankruptcy rates. All of these things are way up. And this affects not just low-income families, but middle-income families, right? So this is what I talk about, what I mean when I talk about the erosion of the social contract. I mean, Americans have long believed that if you work hard, if you put some money away, you should be able to afford a house, afford to send your kid to college, afford to have health care, and this is the basic understanding that has really eroded for tens of millions of Americans
Yeah.
over the last several decades.
Well, and our own Bernie Sanders has been on the road talking about this, using the term oligarchy to,
Yes.
to describe what the situation is with widening inequality in America. And one of the things that's always been interesting about, say, for example, the Sanders presidential campaigns, sometimes he was derided for it, was this big tent crossover appeal that you have folks from all different parts of the political spectrum who seem to be attracted to that message. And that message is a bit like the message that you have in your book, this idea of freedom for all that also hinges on greater economic equality in the United States. Does that sound about right?
It does sound about right, yeah. And I'd say there's very different ways of understanding this kind of big tent. I mean, yes, to win power, you have to build a broad coalition.
Right.
You have to work to assemble a large enough coalition to win elections, take power, and govern, right, effectively. There are different ways of imagining how to do that, though, right? And the Bernie Sanders way, which I admire, is not the sort of tacking to the middle, right?
It's not, right.
Seizing hold of a message about economic inequality
that
is broadly resonant among the electorate.
Because it is broadly experienced also by the electorate.
Absolutely. And look, the polling data is just clear. If over and over again, it shows that Americans are dissatisfied with the level of inequality in their society. I mean, the Pew Research Center ran a series of polls in 2024, which showed that a strong majority of both Republicans and Democrats believe that the economy is rigged in favor of the rich.
Right. I know that's one of those issues that definitely seems to cut through and comes across clearly. So last question, we only have about a minute.
Yes.
What would radical liberalism look like as a big tent idea? Like, how do we achieve it? That's a hard question for 1 minute, but give me the fast answer.
And what I'll just give you the skeleton answer. Okay. One of the things, so I've talked about unequal wealth, unequal opportunity. I haven't talked yet much about unequal power, which is in some ways upstream of these other inequalities. Until we redress the fundamental imbalance of power in the society, where you have rich people and the money they're pouring into our election cycles and their lobbyists essentially calling the shots, we're not going to get anywhere. So what we absolutely have to do is rebuild what I call countervailing power. And that begins with rebuilding the power of unions and organized labor. It involves rethinking the way corporations are governed. This idea that the shareholder is king and nobody else has a voice at the table has to go, frankly. It's not working. It involves finding ways of mobilizing citizens, and here I think of organizations like the Debt Collective or the Los Angeles Renters Union, and there's all kinds of interesting work going on
More
out
coalitions.
there to build grassroots citizen power and begin pushing back.
Another, I have to say again, Senator Sanders would be a very big proponent of these grassroots coalition. For more, and you should definitely dig into this more, the book is Freedom for All, What a Liberal Society Could Be. Pick up a copy at your local bookstore or find it at your local library. Dr. Zakaras, thank you so much for joining me. Always enjoy a riveting political conversation. That was a good one.
Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. As always, Vermont, thank you for learning and exploring with me today. And thanks to the team that makes Across the Fence possible. I'm Amy Finley. This is Across the Fence. Come back and let's learn and explore again tomorrow.